The courtroom buzzed with the low hum of anticipation. A sea of solemn faces filled the gallery, eager to witness the trial that had captivated the town for weeks. It wasn't every day that a case like this came to such a small courthouse, the kind of trial that felt ripped from the pages of a gritty crime novel. The accused, a shadowy figure at the center of an embezzlement and fraud scandal, sat at the defense table, head bowed, hands tightly clasped together. His identity had been shrouded in secrecy throughout the investigation, but today, the curtain was about to be lifted. Judge Ethan Caldwell, a man known for his stern demeanor and unwavering commitment to justice, adjusted his robe and cleared his throat. The courtroom fell silent in an instant. Ethan's gaze swept across the room, landing briefly on the defense table. His hand paused mid-motion, his breath catching in his throat as he caught sight of the defendant's face. It was him. The realization hit like a freight train, a visceral punch that made his chest tighten. Ethan recognized the man sitting there, not as an accused criminal, but as someone who had once been a part of his life. A name surfaced in his mind, unbidden and undeniable. Noah Grayson, his best friend from 20 years ago. Ethan gripped the edge of the bench, his mind spiraling back to the last time he had seen Noah. They had been inseparable once, partners in every sense of the word. Ethan, the aspiring lawyer with a moral compass as steady as the North Star, and Noah, the charming risk-taker who could talk his way out of anything. But their paths had diverged, torn apart by a single betrayal Ethan had vowed never to revisit. Until now. Will the defendant please rise? Noah rose slowly, his face pale but his posture defiant. His eyes scanned the room and froze when they landed on Ethan. For a split second, neither man moved, their shared history crackling in the air like an unspoken secret. Ethan's chest constricted with a mix of anger, betrayal, and something he couldn't quite name. The prosecutor began outlining the charges, her voice sharp and deliberate. Embezzlement, fraud, conspiracy. Each word hammered the courtroom like a gavel, but Ethan barely registered them. His attention was fixed on Noah, searching his face for answers. Was this the same man he had once called brother? Or had the years reshaped him into a stranger? The prosecutor's voice cut through his thoughts. Your Honor, the evidence will show that Mr. Grayson orchestrated a scheme to defraud hundreds of investors out of millions of dollars. The gallery gasped. Ethan's grip on the bench tightened. The name Grayson echoed in his ears, a stark reminder that the man before him wasn't just a defendant. He was a ghost from a life Ethan had buried long ago. The moment lingered, heavy with unspoken questions. Ethan forced himself to regain composure, but his thoughts churned relentlessly. He had sworn an oath to uphold justice, yet now justice demanded he preside over a trial that was anything but impartial. Proceed, Ethan said finally, his voice steady but cold. As the trial began, a storm brewed within him, a tempest of conflicting emotions. But one thought drowned out all the others. Why, after all these years, had Noah Grayson walked back into his life? The courtroom plunging into chaos as a witness fainted. The gallery erupted in whispers, and Ethan's gavel slammed down in a futile attempt to restore order. Secrets lingered in the air, and the weight of unfinished business pressed heavily on Ethan's shoulders. The courtroom emptied for the lunch recess, leaving Judge Ethan Caldwell alone on the bench. He remained seated, staring at the empty defense table where Noah had sat only moments ago. The past rushed back like floodwaters breaching a dam. 20 years ago, their lives couldn't have been more different. Ethan had grown up in a modest home, his mother working 2 jobs to ensure he could attend college. Books and ambition were his refuge, and he'd worked tirelessly to rise above his circumstances. Noah, on the other hand, had been the golden boy of Coldwater Heights, the wealthiest neighborhood in town. His family owned half the businesses in the city, but Noah had never flaunted his privilege. He was magnetic, with a wit and charm that seemed to make the world bend to his will. They met in their first year at university. Ethan had been struggling with his constitutional law coursework, and Noah had breezed into the library, offering help without being asked. A mind like yours shouldn't be bogged down with footnotes, he'd said with a grin, tossing a legal dictionary onto the table. From that day, they were inseparable. Noah introduced Ethan to a world of luxury and opportunity Ethan could hardly fathom. Extravagant parties, powerful people, and high-stakes games. At first, Ethan resisted, feeling out of place among Noah's affluent friends. But Noah had a way of making Ethan feel indispensable, always referring to him as the brains of the operation. Yet, beneath the glamour, there were cracks. Noah's charm masked a reckless streak. He loved the thrill of pushing boundaries, whether it was bending campus rules or dabbling in the gray areas of business. Ethan tried to keep him grounded, often acting as the voice of reason. But their friendship was tested when Noah's ambitions began skirting the edge of legality. The breaking point came during their senior year. Ethan had uncovered that Noah had used his name to secure a fraudulent loan, a move that could have ruined Ethan's burgeoning career. When confronted, Noah brushed it off. "It's just paperwork, Ethan. You're overreacting." Ethan wasn't overreacting. The betrayal severed their friendship. Ethan reported the matter, ensuring Noah was held accountable by the university but stopping short of pressing charges. They hadn't spoken since. Now, years later, Noah's return to Ethan's life was like a dormant volcano erupting without warning. As the lunch hour ended, Ethan retreated to his chambers. The soundproof walls gave him no solace from the questions swirling in his mind. What had happened to Noah after all these years? Had he truly changed, or was this trial proof that the reckless, self-serving man he had known was still alive and well? Ethan's thoughts were interrupted by a knock on the door. His clerk, Sarah, poked her head in. "Judge Caldwell, you have a visitor." "I'm not taking visitors right now," he replied curtly. Sarah hesitated. "It's the defendant. He insisted it was urgent." Ethan's stomach clenched. He knew he should deny the request. Any contact outside the courtroom would be inappropriate. But curiosity and a nagging sense of unfinished business won out. He nodded. Noah entered the chambers, his once effortless swagger now replaced with a careful, almost hesitant gait. The years had etched themselves onto his face, but the confident glint in his eyes remained. "Ethan," he began, his voice low but steady. "I owe you an explanation." Ethan leaned back, his expression unreadable. "I'm listening." Noah let out a slow breath. "Look, I know what you're thinking. I'm the same guy who cut corners, made selfish decisions, and left you to clean up the mess. And maybe I deserve that. But this case, it's not what it seems." Ethan's eyes narrowed. "Then explain it to me, because right now, all I see is a man accused of defrauding hundreds of people out of their savings." Noah ran a hand through his hair, the weight of the situation visible in his slumped shoulders. "The truth is, I didn't even know about half of this until it was too late. I got involved with the wrong people, Ethan. I thought I could outsmart them, but I ended up being the fall guy. And why should I believe you?" Ethan's voice was cold, but beneath it was a flicker of the trust they once shared. "Because you know me," Noah said, stepping closer. "You know I've made mistakes, but you also know I'm not capable of destroying lives like this. Look into the evidence. Really look at it. You'll see the gaps, the inconsistencies. They're using me to cover up something bigger." Ethan held his gaze, conflicted. He wanted to believe Noah, but years of betrayal and distance weighed heavily between them. Noah straightened, a hint of the old fire in his eyes. "I'm not asking for a favor, Ethan. I'm asking for the truth. That's what you stand for, isn't it?" As the trial resumed, the courtroom was electric with tension. Ethan observed Noah carefully, searching for signs of the man he had once trusted. The prosecutor presented damning evidence: wire transfers, forged signatures, and witness testimonies that painted Noah as a mastermind. But something about it felt too neat, too rehearsed. Ethan's mind raced. Could Noah be telling the truth? Or was this just another elaborate scheme, one more con in a lifetime of deception? By the end of the day, Ethan was no closer to answers. The gallery emptied once more, leaving him alone to wrestle with the storm of emotions brewing inside him. He opened Noah's case file, his fingers hesitating over the pages. Buried in the stack of documents was a letter handwritten, its edges worn. It was addressed to Ethan. Ethan sat alone in his chambers, the handwritten letter trembling slightly in his hand. He unfolded the paper, his pulse quickening. The words, penned in Noah's unmistakable scrawl, struck him like hammer blows. "Ethan, I know you think you've figured me out, but there's more to this story than the prosecution will tell you. 20 years ago, I let you down. I didn't value the trust you placed in me, and I paid the price. This time, the stakes are bigger than either of us. You'll find the truth where you least expect it. I'm counting on you to see through the lies." Noah had signed it simply, "Your old friend, N." Ethan leaned back, the weight of the letter heavy in his lap. His instincts screamed to stay impartial, to let the evidence speak for itself. But Noah's words scratched at something deep inside him, a mix of nostalgia and doubt. What if Noah wasn't lying? The next day, Ethan arrived at the courthouse early, determined to approach the trial with a critical eye. He listened intently as the prosecutor, Meredith Walsh, laid out the case. Her arguments were meticulous, the evidence damning. Falsified records, encrypted emails tied to Noah, and testimony from a key witness, Marcus Porter, who claimed to have worked with Noah on the scheme. But something about Marcus's testimony felt off. He avoided direct eye contact, his answers rehearsed. When Ethan pressed for clarification, Marcus fumbled, contradicting himself about dates and details. Ethan's suspicion deepened during cross-examination when Noah's defense attorney, a tenacious young lawyer named Claire Jennings, began poking holes in the prosecution's timeline. Claire highlighted discrepancies in the financial records, suggesting that transactions tied to Noah had been altered post facto. "Your Honor," Claire said, her voice steady but sharp, "these records don't prove my client's involvement. They prove someone wanted to frame him." The gallery murmured, and Meredith shot to her feet. "Objection. Speculation." Ethan's gavel struck. "Sustained. Counselor, stick to the evidence." But inside, his unease grew. Later that afternoon, during a recess, Ethan summoned Noah to his chambers again. The move was highly unconventional, but Ethan needed answers. Noah entered, his face lined with exhaustion. "You're breaking protocol, Judge Caldwell," he said wryly. "Spare me the commentary." Ethan shot back. "Tell me the truth. All of it." Noah hesitated, then leaned forward, his voice low. "I didn't orchestrate this, Ethan. I was approached by a man named Victor Hale, a supposed investor with connections to the firms I was managing. He claimed he could double our returns. I was skeptical, but he provided documentation, contracts. It all looked legitimate. Until," Ethan pressed, "until I realized the contracts were a front. By the time I uncovered the scam, Victor had siphoned millions into offshore accounts, leaving me to take the fall." Ethan's brow furrowed. "And you didn't report this?" "I tried," Noah said, his voice cracking. "But every avenue I pursued led to dead ends. The people involved are powerful, Ethan. They own the banks, the auditors, even some of the law firms. When I pushed back, they threatened my family." Noah leaned back, the weight of his words hanging in the air. "I need you to believe me, not as a judge, but as the friend who used to know me better than anyone." Ethan's throat tightened, but he kept his expression neutral. "I'll consider what you've said." The trial continued, and Ethan's doubts grew. Meredith called another witness, Angela Harper, a financial analyst who claimed to have traced the missing funds to accounts under Noah's control. But during cross-examination, Claire produced a forensic report suggesting the accounts had been opened using forged credentials. Angela faltered, unable to explain the discrepancy. "Your Honor," Claire said, her voice rising, "this is a coordinated effort to incriminate my client. The evidence has been manipulated, and the prosecution has failed to account for it." Meredith objected, her frustration evident. "Your Honor, the defense is grasping at straws. The evidence is clear." Ethan's gavel struck again. "Enough. This court will reconvene tomorrow. Both sides will present their findings on this matter." As the courtroom emptied, Ethan noticed a man in the gallery who hadn't been there before, a sharp-dressed figure with an air of authority. Their eyes met briefly, and something about the man's smirk unsettled Ethan. That evening, Ethan delved into the case files, determined to uncover the truth. He reviewed every document, scrutinized every piece of evidence. Then he found it, a sealed affidavit buried in the discovery packet. The document referenced Victor Hale as a key witness in a related case, a name Noah had mentioned but the prosecution had ignored. Ethan's pulse quickened. Why hadn't this been disclosed earlier? And why had Meredith steered the trial away from Hale's involvement? Unable to shake his suspicions, Ethan did something he'd never done before. He reached out to an old contact at the FBI. Within hours, his contact confirmed Hale's history of fraud and money laundering. But there was a catch. Hale had disappeared months ago, leaving a trail of ruined lives behind him. Ethan's mind raced. If Hale was involved, Noah might be telling the truth. But without concrete evidence, the court would convict him anyway. The next day, tensions in the courtroom reached a boiling point. Claire presented new evidence. A set of emails tying Victor Hale to Marcus Porter. The emails suggested Marcus had orchestrated the fraud alongside Hale, implicating Noah only after the scheme unraveled. The gallery erupted in murmurs, but Meredith's response was swift and decisive. She introduced a rebuttal witness, a private investigator who claimed to have seen Noah meeting with Hale after the fraud was discovered. Noah's face paled as the investigator detailed their alleged meeting. They were seen exchanging documents in a parking garage, the investigator testified. Claire objected, but the damage was done. Ethan struggled to maintain his composure. Was Noah lying after all? As the trial neared its conclusion, Ethan received an anonymous tip, a flash drive containing encrypted files. He opened it cautiously, his screen filling with spreadsheets, account records, and correspondence that painted a damning picture of Victor Hale's operations. But among the files was something even more shocking. A photo of Meredith Walsh and Victor Hale together at a luxury resort, dated just weeks before the fraud began. Ethan's breath caught. The prosecutor was compromised. Ethan staring at the photo, his mind racing with questions. Was Meredith part of the scheme? How deep did the corruption run? And most importantly, what would he do with this knowledge? Ethan sat behind the bench, his fingers tightening around the edges of his gavel. The trial had turned into a vortex of accusations, rebuttals, and hidden agendas. He couldn't shake the image of the photo Meredith Walsh and Victor Hale together at the resort. The revelation gnawed at him, threatening the very integrity of the trial. As the court convened for what was expected to be a final round of arguments, the air was thick with tension. Meredith began her closing statement, her tone sharp and confident. She painted Noah as a master manipulator, a man who thrived on exploiting trust for personal gain. Ethan listened carefully, watching for cracks in her performance. She was good, too good. Her arguments were polished, her evidence meticulously presented. But there was something almost rehearsed about her delivery. When it was Claire's turn, she shifted the narrative. This trial isn't just about Mr. Grayson, she said, pacing in front of the jury. It's about a system of corruption that allowed this crime to happen. Victor Hale wasn't working alone, and the evidence suggests he had help from people in positions of power. Her words sent a ripple through the courtroom. Meredith immediately objected, her voice laced with anger. Objection. Baseless accusations meant to distract from the facts. Sustained, Ethan said, his tone measured, but his mind was far from neutral. The courtroom erupted in gasps as Marcus Porter, the prosecution's star witness, stood up mid-proceedings. He looked pale, sweat beading on his forehead. Your Honor, Marcus stammered, his voice shaking. I need to say something. Meredith's face froze, her eyes narrowing. Mr. Porter, sit down, she hissed, her composure cracking. But Ethan raised a hand. Let him speak. Marcus took a deep breath, his gaze darting between Meredith and the defense table. I lied, he blurted out. About everything. I was pressured to pin this on Noah Grayson. Victor Hale, he threatened me, said he'd ruin my life if I didn't cooperate. And, he paused, his voice faltering. And she knew. He pointed a trembling finger at Meredith. The gallery exploded into chaos. Ethan banged his gavel repeatedly, his voice booming. Order. Order in the court. Meredith rose, her face pale but defiant. Your Honor, this is absurd. The witness is clearly. Enough, Ethan interrupted, his tone icy. We'll recess. Bailiff, take Mr. Porter into custody for perjury. This court needs clarity, and we will get it. As the courtroom emptied, Ethan called Meredith into his chambers. She walked in, her shoulders squared, but there was a flicker of unease in her eyes. Judge Caldwell, this is highly irregular, she began, but Ethan cut her off. I want answers, he said, sliding the photo of her and Victor Hale across the desk. This was taken 3 weeks before the fraud began. Care to explain? Meredith stared at the photo, her expression unreadable. For a moment, Ethan thought she might deny it, but then she let out a bitter laugh. You think this proves something? She said, her voice cold. Fine. I knew Victor Hale. I worked with him on a few cases years ago, but that doesn't mean I'm complicit in this scheme. Then why didn't you disclose your connection? Ethan pressed. Why bury evidence that could exonerate Noah? Meredith's composure cracked, her voice rising. Because Noah isn't innocent, Ethan. He may not have orchestrated this, but he knew what was happening. He just didn't care until it started falling apart. Her words hung in the air, heavy with implication. Ethan stared at her, his mind racing. Was she telling the truth, or was this another layer of deception? That night, Ethan reviewed the encrypted files from the flash drive, piecing together the financial trail Victor Hale had left behind. As he worked, a pattern emerged, one that sent a chill down his spine. Noah's accounts had been manipulated, but not just by Hale. The final transactions, the ones that tied Noah to the missing funds, had been authorized after Hale's disappearance. Someone else had access to the accounts, someone inside the system. Ethan's heart pounded as he cross-referenced the data. The trail led back to an offshore account linked not to Noah, but to Marcus Porter and Meredith Walsh. The next day, the courtroom was packed, the tension palpable. Meredith sat at the prosecution table, her expression unreadable. Noah sat beside Claire, his face a mask of grim determination. Ethan took a deep breath and addressed the court. Before we proceed with closing arguments, this court has new evidence to consider. He nodded to the bailiff, who handed out copies of the encrypted files. These documents reveal a financial trail that implicates not just Victor Hale, but other individuals connected to this case. Mr. Porter and Prosecutor Walsh. Gasps filled the courtroom. Meredith shot to her feet, her face a mask of fury. Your Honor, this is outrageous. Sit down, Ms. Walsh, Ethan said, his voice cold. This court will hear no more from you today. Claire seized the moment. Your Honor, this evidence not only exonerates my client but proves he was set up by a coordinated effort involving Victor Hale, Marcus Porter, and members of the prosecution's team. The jury looked stunned. Meredith slumped in her chair, her career unraveling before everyone's eyes as the dust settled. Noah stood to address the court. Your Honor, I have one final piece of information. Victor Hale isn't missing. The gallery erupted. Ethan froze. Explain, he demanded. Noah nodded toward the back of the courtroom, where the sharp-dressed man Ethan had noticed earlier rose from his seat. That's him, Noah said. That's Victor Hale. The man smirked as 2 federal agents moved to detain him. You think you've won? Hale sneered. This isn't over. Not by a long shot. The scene ended with Hale being led away, the courtroom buzzing with shock. Ethan sat back, the weight of the trial finally lifting. But the mysteries surrounding Hale's network lingered, a reminder that justice was a never-ending pursuit. The courtroom was silent as the verdict was read. We, the jury, find the defendant, Noah Grayson, not guilty. A collective sigh rippled through the gallery, followed by murmurs of relief and disbelief. Noah closed his eyes, his shoulders sagging as the weight of months of accusations finally lifted. Claire placed a hand on his arm, her expression one of quiet triumph. Judge Ethan Caldwell sat at the bench, his face composed but his mind swirling. The trial had tested every fiber of his being, forcing him to confront not only the legal intricacies of the case, but also the fractured remains of a friendship he thought he'd left behind. Meredith Walsh was escorted out of the courtroom, her career and reputation in ruins. As she passed Ethan, she paused, her eyes filled with a mixture of anger and resignation. You think you've won, Caldwell, she said softly, but the system's cracks go deeper than you realize. Ethan said nothing, watching as she disappeared through the doors. The trial had exposed not just a conspiracy but the fragility of the justice system he had sworn to uphold. Victor Hale's smug smirk as he was led away in handcuffs lingered in Ethan's mind. Though one chapter of the case had closed, it was clear that Hale's influence was far from extinguished. After the court adjourned, Ethan found Noah waiting in the hallway. For a moment, neither man spoke. The years of silence between them hung heavy, their shared history a fragile bridge. You could have told me the truth sooner, Ethan said finally, his voice tinged with both reproach and relief. Noah nodded. You're right. I didn't think you'd believe me, and part of me thought I didn't deserve your help after what I did back then. Ethan studied him, searching for traces of the reckless young man he'd once called a friend. Instead, he saw a man who had been beaten down but not broken. You were wrong, Ethan said, his voice softer now. I did believe you. Eventually. A faint smile flickered across Noah's face. That's more than I deserve. Ethan shook his head. You're right about one thing, though. This doesn't erase the past. But maybe it's a step toward rebuilding something. Noah extended a hand. Ethan hesitated for a heartbeat, then clasped it firmly. That night, Ethan returned to his chambers, the courtroom empty and quiet. He sat at his desk, the photo of Meredith and Victor Hale still lying where he'd left it. He stared at it for a long moment before tucking it into a folder marked closed cases. Justice, he realized, was rarely as clear-cut as he wanted it to be. The trial had exposed not just corruption but the flaws in every individual involved, himself included. As he locked the folder away, he thought of the jury's verdict, of Noah's quiet relief and Meredith's bitter warning. The next morning, Ethan stood before a group of law students at a lecture he had been scheduled to give for months. He spoke not about the technicalities of law but about the human side of justice. Justice isn't about perfection, he said, his voice steady. It's about the pursuit of truth, no matter how complicated or uncomfortable that truth may be. It's about holding ourselves accountable, not just to the law, but to the values that guide us. He paused, letting the words settle. And above all, it's about understanding that people are flawed. They make mistakes, they betray, and they lie. But they also redeem, forgive, and change. It's our job to see them as they are, not just as who they've been. The students leaned in, captivated. For the first time in weeks, Ethan felt a measure of peace. As Ethan left the lecture hall, he spotted Noah standing at a distance. He was leaning against a car, waiting. Ethan approached, a small smile playing on his lips. Coffee? Noah asked. Ethan nodded. Why not? The two men walked down the street, the city bustling around them. It wasn't a clean slate, but it was a start. And sometimes Ethan thought that was enough.